Don't let my cute little milkmaid braids deceive you. I actually have not washed my hair in weeks. Hey howdy, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to talk about some more murder. So if you don't like that, get the hell out of here right now. Today I'm going to talk about 3 cases that I believe are disturbing enough / crazy enough that they deserve their own books or like docu-series. A couple of them do have books written about them, but they're either like older books or like more of a psychological study of a book than like a actual mass market book. So they're just cases mostly that I think deserve more attention or deserve to be talked about more. So let's get into them. First case I want to tell you about is the trial of Nellie May Madison, who is maybe the coolest bitch ever. On March 24th of 1934, she shot her husband in the back 5 times. She initially ran from the murder scene, and after they hunted her down and they asked her what she did to her husband, she claimed that the man that was dead was not her husband. She claimed that he was a different man. She had no idea who he was. So they hunted down his ex-wife and they were like, "Is this man your ex-husband?" And the wife was like, "Yeah, that was my ex-husband." And so they had her testify, and then Nellie May Madison was the first woman to ever be sentenced to death in California. After she was sentenced, she made an appeal, and in the appeal she stated that she was severely abused. Her husband had been a horrible person, and on the night of the murder, he had thrown 2 knives at her prior to her shooting him. On her appeal, when she went to trial, instead of the prosecution calling up his ex-wife, the defense called up his ex-wife, and his ex-wife claimed that he had been horribly abusive to her as well, just a really shitty guy. And Nellie May Madison was the first woman ever to actually have like a battered woman defense, and she really brought light to the fact that you could be murdering your spouse in order to protect yourself, which is really cool, super crazy, and I think she deserves way more credit than she gets. She still went to prison for her whole life, but obviously since then a lot of women have been able to avoid prison by using self-defense. She was one of the first women who was believed for her story of abuse. The second case I want to tell you about is probably the saddest. I'm gonna put a severe trigger warning on this one for child abuse and child neglect. In April of 2000 in Evergreen, Colorado, there was a girl, a little girl, she was 11, her name was Candace Newmaker. She had been a foster child, and she had her adoptive parents, her foster parents, were having issues with her at home, saying that she was killing goldfish and having problems, and so they took her to this special kind of therapy called attachment therapy that they give to children that have had rough lives. And at the time, there was a method in practice called a rebirthing therapy, which basically is where they wrap a child up in a blanket and kind of like put a lot of pressure on them and like push them around in order for them to act like they're being rebirthed. It's a very bizarre technique that is illegal in some states now. She was referred by a psychiatrist to a therapist who was not licensed, and they brought her in for this rebirth therapy, and the therapist names were Connell Watkins and Julie Ponder. Both of them were in the room at the time that they did this rebirth therapy, as well as 3 other adults who were her foster parents or her social worker. There was 5 adults in the room with her when this happened, and they wrapped her in the blanket and they started pushing her around, and she kept saying no, and that she didn't want to do it, and that she couldn't breathe, and that she needed to be let out, and she had vomited in the blanket, and they just didn't let her out because they believed that this was what they needed to do in order to help her. And she ended up dying. She ended up suffocating in the blanket, and they waited to call the cops until 10 minutes after they realized she was dead, and then they called the cops, and they said that she had been left alone in the room, and that was how she had died. She'd been unattended, but then they looked back at the tapes and realized that she had indeed been left in there to die while the adults were watching her was continually being verbally abused the whole time that it was happening. The therapists were only sentenced to 14 years. One of them only ended up serving 7 and is currently out on parole, which is crazy to me. Thankfully, she is forbidden from practicing any kind of therapy or being near children. The thing that I find most fascinating about this is that, one, that was ever an acceptable way to treat children. Thanks to this case, there's been laws enacted in a few states stating that you can no longer use this rebirthing technique because it's dangerous to children. And multiple children have died this way. She's not the only kid that has ever died through this technique. And so the fact that it's even in practice at all is insane to me. And the fact that anyone would ever think that that was a practical way to fix a person is bizarre to me as well. I think that it would be really fascinating to learn more about kind of the mentality behind the therapists and why they thought that this was an okay thing to do and why they continued doing it even after Candace showed signs of fear and distress, and they just didn't help her. And I want to know why they didn't help her. I want to know why the foster parents didn't step in and do something about it. It's just a really crazy story to me, and it's bizarre to me that there's even a way that people like that can medically practice. Let me take a drink here. All this murder makes me thirsty. The third case that I think deserves a book probably only doesn't have a book already because it's fairly recent, and that is the serial killer Terry Rasmussen. I recently read Chase Darkness with Me by Billy Jensen, and he was involved a lot in one of the cases that Terry Rasmussen is accused of. There was 4 people, 1 woman and 3 children, found in barrels out in the middle of the Midwest, just sitting in the woods. Somebody found the barrels and opened them, and inside there was bodies, and they had no idea who they were. They had no idea who killed them. This man, Terry Rasmussen, who was going by a different name at the time, he had this girl he was claiming was his daughter, and he was at a trailer park, and for some reason there was people that were looking to adopt a child, and he was really struggling to pay for her, he claimed, and so he said, well, I have business to do, could you watch her for a few days, and then as a trial period, and then we'll like look into you guys adopting her. And he left her there with them, and he never came back. And so when he never came back, they started looking into him more. It turns out that he had like 4 or 5 different names that he was using, and he had been all over the US. And so they started looking around at all these missing persons cases and these unsolved murders and connecting them to him through DNA. He was a serial killer who murdered women, and then he would use their children to attract new victims, all the while molesting and abusing the children until he got a new victim, and then he would kill the children. It's just a really horrible story, and one of the worst serial killers out there that I can think of. It's like, that is truly evil, a truly evil thing to do, to take advantage of mothers and children like that. And there's just so little that's known about him. There's so many cases. I think they've connected like 7 or 8 to him now through DNA. The woman and the children that were in the barrels have been identified now, and it has been determined through DNA that he murdered them all. He murdered his own children, he murdered this woman's children and her. And he's just, haunting. And I think it would be important to do a deep dive so you could kind of get his exact timeline of where he was and when, so that we could get it out there and connect him to a lot more cases that he could potentially be connected to. That's it. That's the 3 cases that I think deserve a book, or just more attention in general. So yeah, now that I've thoroughly depressed everyone, I hope that you learned something from this video. I hope that you go and look more into these cases if you find them interesting, and also look into cases that maybe don't get enough attention or credit, because there's a ton out there. There's a ton of cases out there that you can find on the internet that you've never heard of before, and you know, everybody that is murdered deserves to their story to be told and deserves their story to be heard. And so here's just 3 that I wanted to share with you. 3 stories that I wanted to be heard. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next week. There will be 2 videos next week. My May wrap up and my June TBR will both be going up, so make sure you check back next week for those. Bye.